Hello, welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've been here before. My name is Bethanne. Today what I want to talk about is rereading Pride and Prejudice. So for anyone who's been around my channel for a little while, you might know that one of my 2021 reading goals is to read Jane Austen's 6 major novels, and then I'm companion reading with those a critique of Jane Austen's work. So this is Jane Austen, The Secret Radical by Helena Kelly. And so for my first selection in my Austen challenge for 2021, I read Pride and Prejudice along with the introductory information in The Secret Radical and the chapter that pertains to Pride and Prejudice. So just a quick note on rereading Pride and Prejudice. This was actually only the second time that I've read it. I kind of felt like I'd read it more because I'm so familiar with Pride and Prejudice as it's so dominant in our culture and in pop culture. And I've seen the BBC miniseries so many times, and so I kind of felt like I'd read the book more, but I went back and checked in my records, and this was actually only the second time I read it. And the first time I read it was as assigned reading in high school, I want to say in 10th grade. So we're talking over 15 years ago. I don't know. How old are people in 10th grade in the US? Like 15, 16? And I'm 32. So somebody do the math. So it's been a while since I read this. And it really held the test of time. I absolutely loved it. I think it's kind of a perfect novel. I know plenty of people would disagree with me, and that's fine. But yeah, I absolutely adored this. I adore the characters. I adore the storytelling. Even the really obnoxious, annoying characters, you just kind of love because they're in there for a reason. So this was definitely a 5-star book for me. Just loved it, hands down. But then the most interesting thing to me, because it's really quite a straightforward story in and of itself in Pride and Prejudice. And so what I really want to talk about is what I gained from reading this book. And so one of the key premises for this book is that we know so little about Jane Austen's actual life. And so if you want to think about who she was or what she was trying to accomplish with her novels, we have very, very little material to base, our understanding of her on. And so this author argues that rather than focusing so much on the small number of her letters and on her family's testimony that's available, what we really have in terms of the strongest representation of Austen's voice itself is the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of words in her novels, and that's what we should take as the primary evidence when we're trying to figure out who she was. And so one thing that this author really wants to convince her readers of, and Austen's readers of, is how radical and revolutionary Jane Austen was in the social and political era that she lived in Britain, which was the very end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century. And so the beginning of this book, Helena Kelly sets up some of the domestic repercussions of the wars and political upheaval that was going on in Britain. And so just as a summary, if people will just bear with me, I just wanted to read kind of her list of the things that made it really dangerous and scary to be a writer in the time when Austen was writing. She writes, throughout Jane's late teens and 20s, the government built coastal batteries and forts to defend Britain against invasion from France, and it brought in a number of measures designed to protect the country against the spread of danger from within. In the process, Britain began to look more and more like a totalitarian state, with the unpleasant habits that totalitarian states acquire. Habeas corpus, the centuries-old requirement that any detention be publicly justified, was suspended. Treason was redefined. It was no longer limited to actively conspiring to overthrow and to kill. It included thinking, writing, printing, reading. Prosecutions were directed not just against avowedly political figures, such as Thomas Paine, the radical politician Horne Tooke, and the theologian Gilbert Wakefield, but against their publishers. A schoolmaster was convicted for distributing leaflets. A man was prosecuted for putting up posters. The proprietors of the newspaper The Morning Chronicle were brought into court. Booksellers were threatened. Words were dangerous. Reciting a piece of doggerel saw one Hampshire carpenter imprisoned for 3 years. There can hardly have been a thinking person in Britain who didn't understand what was intended, to terrify writers and publishers into policing themselves. So Kelly is arguing that for all of the critics that kind of discount Austen as being frivolous romantic literature, that Austen had very little recourse to do anything else because she was a single woman with no political or social or financial capital. Essentially, she was entirely dependent on, essentially charity from her family and on the money that she earned from publishing her books. So she had very little safety net, especially compared to some of the, wealthier political figures of her day. And so she really had, if she was going to express a political or social opinion, she was not going to be able to write it outright. That was just impossible in the Britain in which she was living. And so is it any surprise then to start wondering, okay, are her fluffy, light romances, are they coding something deeper? So then one of the points that she goes on to say, and again, I'm just going to read, this is a much shorter passage that I'm just going to read, just pointing out some of the broader, more obvious things in Pride and Prejudice. And so after I read this, then I want to talk about just kind of two other points that she goes into in much more detail in the chapter devoted to Pride and Prejudice. But I just have one more thing I wanted to share from some of the introductory information. So Kelly writes, in Pride and Prejudice, the militia officers quartered in the heroine's hometown spend their time socializing, flirting, and, on one occasion, cross-dressing rather than defending the realm. The Reverend Mr. Collins is laughable. None of Jane Austen's clergymen characters have vocations, or even seem to care very much about the well-being, spiritual or physical, of their parishioners. Does Mr. Darcy's arrogant, interfering aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, look like a character designed to justify the aristocracy? And so in Pride and Prejudice, she's pointing out some really obvious themes that anyone else who's read the book will immediately recognize. I mean, the militia is partly laughable, and then it is also very overtly recognized as a danger to the small town where the militia is quartered. They're a threat to the young women, like that sort of thing. And then in addition, what Kelly is pointing out is absolutely true. Mr. Collins is an utterly ludicrous character that everybody kind of hates, and he's a representative of the Church of England. And the only true aristocracy that we see in the person of Lady Catherine de Bourgh and other members of Darcy's family, they're not nice people. Even Darcy is someone that we dislike very much from the beginning of the book. And we only come to like him upon further acquaintance, but even then we are really focused on the flaws of his character. So the nobility and the aristocracy is not something to admire in Pride and Prejudice, and the clergy is not something to admire in Pride and Prejudice. And that is very revolutionary for that time in England to be writing that. And then two other points that she goes into those particular points in much more detail in the chapter that's focused on Pride and Prejudice, but then there were two other kind of bigger ideas that I thought were absolutely fascinating. So one of the things that Kelly points out is that, so again, that idea that all of the aristocracy, all of the characters from the aristocracy are not good people. The best people in the story, the ones who have no flaws, are the Gardners, are Elizabeth Bennet's aunt and uncle, who are in trade in London, and they are the only people that are, kind of totally upstanding and reasonable people, other than maybe Jane Bennet, perhaps. But we're essentially, she's so nice that she can be kind of useless, right? Whereas the Gardners are awesome. And so Jane Austen, like, that's a big message, to have the only characters in your book that can't be criticized in any way, shape, or form are lower class people. And that's a revolutionary thing to write in late 18th century, early 19th century England. And then the other flip side of that is that throughout the book, of course, anybody aristocratic kind of insults and looks down on people who are in trade. We know that Darcy originally wanted to have nothing to do with anybody in Elizabeth Bennet's family because they were just so far beneath him because of the trade connections, right? But one of his best friends, Bingley, who's filthy rich and, sets off the action for the story by moving into this rural neighborhood, all of his wealth comes from trade. And so it's this funny point where, like, you have to be a landowner to be in the very respected class. But if you get rich enough from trade, then people can ignore like that's your background. You just have to get rich enough and then it's fine. But if you're like a middle class or a lower class person in trade, you're looked down on. So that was just kind of an interesting societal thing, I thought. And then another really interesting piece was she goes into a lot of detail, because this is really relevant for Pride and Prejudice, into the details of the formal etiquette of introducing people to each other, and the idea of the formal introduction in this time in England, which is something that's totally foreign to our society today. And so I didn't know anything about it until I read her critique of the introductions in Pride and Prejudice. And it was kind of a big thing. Like, obviously, an unmarried woman can't go talk to a man she's never been introduced to. But the formal introduction, it was a really, really big deal. And so one really interesting piece that, even being a fairly close reader, I never would have picked up on because I lacked the relevant cultural background, was that Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet are never actually formally introduced to each other in the entirety of the book. And so that's one reason why their marriage is so shocking and surprising, is because everybody in their social circles is kind of aware of that, and it means that any relationship between them is impossible. And so it's so shocking when they declare their love and get married. And the way that they both refused to have that introduction happen was a social signal. So at the very beginning of the book, we have the very first time that the Bennet family meets Darcy. There's, some interactions where like Elizabeth is kind of called to his attention, and, Darcy basically says, "I refuse to be introduced to any woman in this room." And so even though this is why it's so weird, because it's like, who each other are. Why do you need to be introduced? But like the fact that he refused that formal introduction was incredibly rude and was a signal of his belief in his social superiority to her. But then later in the book, at a party at the Lucas's house, Sir Lucas tries to initiate an introduction, and he does it in kind of a blundering, rude way. He basically says to the two of them, "Let me introduce you." And Darcy says, "Yes, please introduce us. In this case, I want to dance with this woman." And Elizabeth says, "No, don't introduce me to him. I'm going over here," and just like leaves the conversation. And so she refuses that introduction. And so the code there is that she is refusing to acknowledge his superiority over her. And so after that interaction, they are never formally introduced to each other. And so Kelly was saying that if you were reading this in the time that it was written, you're, especially in kind of the classes of people that Austen is writing about, you would just have this ingrained in you. And so you would be kind of shocked by essentially the impropriety of their relationship, because their entire courtship happens outside of this formal, etiquette approved relationship. So I just thought that was so cool. And it's just like, wow, there's like shocking stuff about this book that like, I don't know. So anyway, so that is, essentially Kelly's argument in a nutshell, is that there are all these very subtle things that you would pick up on if you were a contemporary reader with Jane Austen that we don't pick up on so much. And it's very easy to take the book kind of at face value just as a romance, and probably would have been easy too for some people at the time, except that they were expecting to see kind of coded language because they were in a totalitarian state. It's just that like any one of these things would just fly under the radar. But when you start taking into account that there's like literally nothing in this book almost that's the way it's supposed to go, right? Then it, as a work, it's an incredibly radical work. And we do know that Austen heavily revised all of her writing. She was incredibly particular about her word choice and constructing her sentences and everything, which is something that her family actually tried to hide. Her brother claimed that, her novels were inspiration, that she was a genius, that they just came out of her brain fully formed. But through her own letters and records, we know that the opposite is true, that she worked on these very, very heavily. And so, that's a little bit more in favor too of the idea that she was making all of these choices completely deliberately, because she was pointing out, these issues in her society. Some of these things are ridiculous, and pointing out inequality. And all that sort of thing. So anyway, I just found it totally fascinating, and I'm very excited to continue reading this book and seeing this this academic deconstruct each of Austen's novels. So thanks for sticking with me. If you're a Pride and Prejudice fan, I would love to know what you think. If you have read, other sources that that claim other arguments about Austen, either in the same path or the opposite arguments, that it is just light romance. Yeah, I just love to hear what other people are thinking. And oh, I should also mention that I am part of a year-long readathon or book club or something that's also reading all of Jane Austen's novels. And that group is particularly fun because there's 6 novels, and then for 1 month, like, so for January, we read Pride and Prejudice, but then for the following month, we're going to read a more modern retelling of Pride and Prejudice. And so we'll do that kind of in pairs for each novel with a retelling of it. And all of the retellings are diverse retellings. I think I've looked at all of them, and they're all diverse retellings. And actually, I should just look up real quick to remind myself exactly what the name and author is of the one for February. Yeah, sorry. So it's Pride by Ibi Zoboi, which I might be mispronouncing. So anyway, so if you're interested in doing that read along through the whole year, we have a Discord server where people are chatting about their experiences and impressions reading the book. And February should be a pretty exciting month, I think, because we'll be able to read a retelling of the story that we're all really familiar with already. All right, so with that, I will sign off. If you're not already subscribed, but you would like to see more videos from me, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and leave me a comment letting me know what you think about Pride and Prejudice and Jane Austen. I'd love to chat, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Thanks, bye.